The morning began quietly in the small town of Maplewood, where the sun rose through pale clouds and touched every rooftop with gold. The kitchen was filled with the soft hum of life, the gentle bubbling of oatmeal, the hiss of the kettle, the faint sound of a clock ticking on the wall. Emma stood by the stove wearing a faded blue cardigan, her hair loosely tied back. She looked calm from the outside, but inside her heart felt like a fragile glass about to crack. It had been a year since Richard's passing. Her husband, her friend, the man who used to make the house feel alive. Since then, everything had turned into echoes. His laughter in the hallway, his favorite mug untouched on the shelf, the faint scent of his cologne still clinging to his old coat hanging by the door. Emma had tried to move forward, tried to fill her days with things to do. But grief had its own rhythm. It came and went like waves. And some mornings, like this one, it returned stronger than ever. She stared at the oatmeal boiling on the stove and wondered if she'd ever feel normal again. Then she heard footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the stairs. Her breath caught for a second. The sound reminded her too much of Richard, but she quickly remembered who it was. Daniel, her stepson, had come home for the weekend. He was 27 now, older than when she'd last seen him for more than just a day or two. And though they had kept in touch, this visit felt different. When he walked into the kitchen, the room seemed to shift. The air became heavier, warmer, and somehow more alive. "Morning, Emma," he said softly, his voice carrying a calm tone that made her turn around with a faint smile. He looked so much like his father, the same dark eyes, the same gentle posture, yet there was something more guarded in him, something the years had carved quietly. "Morning," she replied. Trying to sound casual, she reached for a bowl, pretending not to notice how her hands trembled slightly. Daniel smiled as he moved to pour himself a cup of coffee. The smell filled the kitchen. Blending with cinnamon and the faint scent of butter, it felt almost like old times, except for the silence between them that neither quite knew how to break. He sat by the counter, watching her cook. "You're still making Dad's favorite breakfast," he said with a half smile. "Oatmeal with cinnamon and apples." Emma nodded, her voice low. He said it made the mornings feel warmer. For a moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but heavy with shared memories and the quiet pain of loss. Daniel looked away first, sipping his coffee. He had grown broader in the shoulders, his hands rougher, his eyes wiser. Emma noticed without meaning to, not in a way of attraction, but in recognition of time, of how much he had changed since Richard's funeral. He was no longer the quiet young man standing behind his father at family dinners. He carried his own kind of grief, silent, strong and deeply buried. They talked about simple things, about work, about the town, about how empty the house felt now that Richard was gone. Daniel mentioned how he had been offered a promotion in the city, but wasn't sure if he wanted to take it. "It's not the same without him," he said, his tone low. "Even the things I used to love feel different now." Emma wanted to say she understood, but she didn't trust her voice not to break. She turned back to the counter, pouring the oatmeal into 2 bowls. "You know," she said quietly, "he was proud of you, Daniel. He talked about you all the time." Daniel smiled, but his eyes shimmered slightly. "I wish I had told him that I was proud of him too," he whispered. The words hung in the air, soft but full of ache. Emma's hand froze for a moment, the spoon trembling before she set it down. She turned toward him, and before she could stop herself, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was meant to be comfort, a simple, motherly gesture. But when his eyes lifted to hers, something inside her shifted. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter. and her heart began to beat faster. She quickly pulled her hand back, murmuring something about the oatmeal. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable, then stood and walked to the sink. "Do you need help with anything?" he asked after a moment, trying to lighten the mood. She nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Could you pass me the sugar jar?" "It's on the top shelf." He stepped close, reaching up to grab it, his arm brushing against hers as he did. It was such a small touch, yet it sent a warmth through her chest that she didn't expect. "Got it," he said with a small grin, handing her the jar. "Thanks," she whispered. Her voice came out softer than she intended. Daniel paused for a second, his gaze lingering before he turned away. He filled his cup again and leaned against the counter, watching the rain start to fall outside. For a few moments they stood there in silence. Two people connected by the same loss, but separated by years and circumstance. Emma realized how strange it felt to have someone else in the kitchen again. Someone moving, breathing, filling the space with life. She remembered when Richard used to stand exactly where Daniel was now, teasing her about how she always burned the toast. Daniel noticed her expression and smiled gently. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Every day," she said. "He used to make me laugh even when I was mad at him." Daniel's smile softened. "He was good at that," he said. "He made people feel safe." Emma turned to him, eyes glistening. "He did," she whispered. "He made this house feel alive." There was a moment of silence before Daniel spoke again. "You've done a good job keeping it alive, Emma," he said sincerely. She shook her head. "I've just been surviving, Daniel." His words came slowly, almost as if he was afraid to say them. That's still something. Something about the way he said it. Gentle, understanding, broke through the walls she had built around her heart. She suddenly felt seen, not just as Richard's widow, but as herself, a woman who was still trying, still hoping for peace, even after loss. She looked at him, and for the first time, she noticed how kind his eyes were. Not because they looked like Richard's, but because they carried the same sincerity. Daniel reached for his jacket. "I'm going to take a walk," he said quietly. "Do you want to come?" Emma hesitated, glancing out at the drizzle outside. But something inside her wanted to say yes. "Sure," she replied softly. "Just let me grab my scarf." They walked together through the small garden behind the house. The air cool and damp, the grass shimmered with dew, and the smell of wet earth filled the space between them. Daniel talked about his work, his travels, the way the city never truly felt like home. Emma listened, smiling faintly, realizing how much she had missed simple conversation. They reached the old wooden bench under the maple tree, Richard's favorite spot. They sat in silence, each lost in thought. Daniel finally said, "He used to sit here for hours, didn't he?" Emma nodded. "Yes, he said this was where he thought best." Daniel's voice lowered. "I wish I had spent more time with him." Emma looked at him gently. "He knew you loved him," she said. "That was enough for him." Daniel took a deep breath. "Maybe," he whispered. "But I still wish I'd said it more often." The sky darkened slightly as more rain began to fall. They hurried back toward the house, laughing softly as they ran through the drizzle. By the time they stepped back into the kitchen, both were damp and smiling, for the first time in a long while. Emma felt warmth that wasn't just from the stove, but from something inside her heart, something she thought she had lost forever. As Daniel grabbed a towel to dry his hair, he looked at her and said, "It feels good to be home." Emma froze for a moment, then smiled. "It feels good to have you here, Daniel." And in that quiet kitchen, with rain tapping softly against the window, and the scent of cinnamon still in the air. Emma realized something she hadn't in a long time. She wasn't completely alone. There was still connection, still kindness, still warmth left in her world. She didn't know where it would lead, or what it meant. But for the first time since Richard's passing, she felt her heart begin to stir again. And as Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one with a gentle smile, the kitchen filled once more with a fragile, beautiful kind of life. The kind that begins not with laughter, but with shared silence, the kind that feels like healing, slowly finding its way home. The rain had stopped by afternoon, leaving the air fresh and cool. Sunlight spilled through the windows of the kitchen, bouncing softly off the silver handles and pale wooden cabinets. Emma moved quietly, drying dishes, trying to focus on simple motions. But her thoughts kept drifting. She kept remembering the way Daniel had smiled that morning, the warmth in his voice, the look in his eyes when he said it felt good to be home. It shouldn't have stayed with her this long, but it did. And every time she thought of it, her chest filled with something that felt both wrong and right. Daniel was in the living room, tuning the old radio, a faint hum of music floating through the house. It was an old love song, one that Richard used to play. And for a moment, Emma froze, the sound cutting through the calm she had been trying to build. She turned the faucet off, listening quietly. Her eyes softened, remembering the nights she and Richard had danced in this same kitchen, barefoot, laughing at nothing. That memory stung, but it also made her smile. "Sorry," Daniel said as he walked in, noticing her expression. "I didn't mean to bring up old memories." She shook her head quickly. "No, it's fine," she said. "It's a beautiful song." He nodded, leaning against the counter. "He used to hum it every time he cooked, didn't he?" She smiled faintly. "He burned half the dinners he made, but yes, he loved that song." They both laughed, and it felt good, natural, light, like breathing again after holding it too long. For a few minutes they just talked about music, about life, about small things that didn't hurt to say out loud. Emma noticed how easy it was to talk to Daniel now, how he didn't push or judge, just listened. His voice had a calmness that felt grounding, and his eyes, though still filled with quiet sadness, carried a kind of warmth that reached her heart. Later, they decided to cook dinner together, the kitchen once again filled with soft laughter and clinking dishes. Daniel chopped vegetables while Emma stirred the sauce. The air smelled of garlic and herbs. And for a while, everything felt peaceful. "You've gotten good at this," Emma teased. "I didn't know you could cook," Daniel chuckled. "I learned after college, mostly so I wouldn't starve." She laughed. And he looked at her, not just with amusement, but with something gentler, deeper. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was a quiet kind of care, one that made Emma's heart ache a little. The sound of the spoon tapping against the pot filled the air, and then she said softly, "You remind me of him sometimes." Daniel looked up, surprised. "Dad?" She nodded. "Not just in the way you look, but the way you listen, the way you care." He smiled, but there was sadness in his expression. "He was a good man," he said. "I hope I can be half as good someday." Emma turned off the stove and faced him. "You already are," she said quietly. Daniel's eyes met hers, and for a second, everything else faded. The house, the past, the rain outside. It was just the two of them, standing close, caught in a moment neither had expected. The silence grew heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was filled with something unspoken, something fragile. Emma quickly turned away, picking up plates, Dinner's ready, she said, her voice softer than she intended. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the light from the hanging lamp casting a golden glow on their faces. The meal was simple, but somehow it felt more special than anything Emma had eaten in months. Halfway through dinner, Daniel spoke, his tone low. "Do you ever stop missing him?" Emma looked up slowly, her heart tightening. "No," she said. "You just learn to live with it, like a scar that doesn't hurt anymore, but never really fades." He nodded thoughtfully. "I still dream about him sometimes, like he's just there, talking to me." She smiled faintly. "Maybe he is." They ate quietly after that, the kind of silence that feels safe. Emma noticed the way Daniel's eyes softened when he listened. How sincere his words were. How patient his presence felt. It wasn't the kind of comfort that comes from family obligation. It was something more natural. Unspoken, human. After dinner, they washed dishes together, their hands brushing once or twice as they passed plates. Each small touch felt like a spark, not inappropriate. Not planned, but real. It was strange, confusing. Yet neither of them pulled away too quickly. Emma's heart beat faster, not from guilt, but from something she hadn't felt in a long time. The reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling when they finished cleaning up. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her quietly. "You've been strong, Emma," he said. "Most people would have given up by now." She smiled sadly. "I don't feel strong, Daniel. I just get up and keep going." He nodded. "That's what strength looks like." The simplicity of his words hit her harder than she expected. She looked at him, realizing how kind he was, not in a distant or polite way, but in a genuine one. He didn't try to fix her pain. He just understood it. And that kind of understanding was rare, almost dangerous in its tenderness. As night fell, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. The two of them stayed in the kitchen, drinking tea and talking about small things. Favorite movies, memories of childhood, the quiet loneliness of growing older. Daniel shared how he had struggled after Richard's death, how he had buried himself in work, hoping the noise would drown out the grief. Emma listened, her chest tightening with empathy. "You don't have to hide that pain," she said softly. "You don't have to carry it alone." Daniel looked at her, eyes heavy with emotion. "You too," he said. "You've carried too much on your own." The room fell silent again. The only sound was the rain beginning to fall harder outside. Emma felt her throat tighten, wanting to speak but not trusting her voice. He reached out, placing his hand gently over hers on the table. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't wrong, it was human, comforting, and deeply kind. "You're not alone, Emma," he whispered. The words were simple, but they broke something open inside her. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them, and she quickly looked away. "I'm sorry," she murmured, wiping her cheeks. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Daniel interrupted softly. "You don't have to apologize for feeling." His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that made the world quiet for a moment. Emma nodded slowly, trying to compose herself, but her heart was racing. She hadn't been this close to someone in a long time. Emotionally, not physically. It was overwhelming, but in a strange way it felt safe. He gave her a small smile. "I think he'd be proud of you," he said. "You've kept this place alive, even when it hurt." She looked at him, her tears still glimmering. "I just didn't know how to stop missing him," she said. Daniel took a deep breath. "You don't have to stop," he said gently. "You just have to keep living too." For a while, they sat there in silence, just listening to the rain and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just quiet understanding. Emma realized that Daniel wasn't trying to replace anything. He was simply there, steady, kind, and real. And that was something she hadn't felt from anyone since Richard's death. The lights flickered once as thunder rolled again. Daniel stood up to check the back door, making sure it was locked. "Storm's getting stronger," he said. She nodded. "It's been a while since we had one this heavy." He smiled faintly. "Guess it's a good night to stay in." They cleaned up the rest of the kitchen and then sat near the window, watching the rain pour down. The streetlights outside glowed softly, their reflections shimmering across the puddles. Daniel leaned back, his voice quiet. "You know, it doesn't feel like the same house without him." Emma nodded. "It's quieter," she said. "Too quiet sometimes." He turned to her, his tone gentle. "Maybe we can fill it again." She looked at him, not sure how to respond, but his words stayed in her mind long after. The clock struck 9, and she stood to make more tea. He joined her at the counter, helping her reach the mugs from the top shelf. His arm brushed hers again. A small touch, innocent yet charged with emotion. This time, neither of them stepped back right away. Their eyes met, and something unspoken hung in the air. Not desire, not temptation, but connection. Deep, real, and undeniable. Emma looked away first, her heart pounding. "We should sleep soon," she whispered. "It's getting late." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said softly. "Good night, Emma." She watched him walk upstairs, each step quiet and slow. When she was alone again, she leaned against the counter, staring at the rain sliding down the glass. Her reflection looked different, not younger, not older, just alive in a way she hadn't felt in so long. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The sound of the storm filled the house. But it wasn't the thunder keeping her awake. It was the memory of Daniel's words, his kindness, and the way he had looked at her, like someone who saw her, not as a widow, not as his father's wife, but as a person still capable of warmth and light. Something had changed, quietly but deeply, and she didn't know what it meant yet. All she knew was that for the first time since Richard's passing, the silence in her heart had started to fade, replaced by something tender, uncertain, but beautifully human. The next morning began softly. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean and quiet. The sky was pale blue. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh coffee. Emma stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug, watching droplets slide down the glass. The storm had passed, but something inside her hadn't settled yet. Her thoughts were tangled, not painful, but full of emotions she didn't quite understand. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Daniel stood in the doorway, his hair damp from a shower, wearing a simple grey shirt. He smiled, a little shyly. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Emma smiled back. "Good morning," she replied, trying to sound casual, but her heart raced anyway. There was something about the quiet between them that felt different now, more alive, more aware. "Did you sleep?" he asked, walking toward the counter. "A little," she said. "The thunder was too loud." He nodded, pouring himself some coffee. "Yeah, it kept me awake too." He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the morning light falling gently over both of them. For a few moments, neither spoke. The air carried only the faint hum of the fridge and the soft ticking of the wall clock. Then Daniel said quietly, "I've been thinking about yesterday." Emma froze slightly, unsure what he meant. "About what we talked about," he continued. "About not being alone." She looked down at her cup. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said softly. "You spend so long building walls. And then one day, someone just walks right through them." He smiled faintly. "Maybe because they were never walls, just doors waiting to open." His words made her chest tighten. Not in pain, but in recognition. She met his gaze, seeing the same quiet warmth from before, the same understanding that had slowly started to heal her. "You're too kind, Daniel," she said gently. "You always have been." He shrugged slightly, his eyes soft. "I just know what it feels like to lose someone." They both fell silent again, lost in their thoughts. Then Emma stood to start breakfast, moving around the kitchen, reaching for eggs and bread. Daniel joined her without asking, pulling out a pan and butter. They worked side by side in easy rhythm, like they had done this many times before. Occasionally their hands brushed, and each time it happened, a spark of awareness passed through both of them, subtle but impossible to ignore. "Remember when Dad used to burn toast every Sunday?" Daniel said, smiling. "He said it was his tradition." Emma laughed. "He said it gave breakfast more character." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, character that tasted like smoke." They both laughed. And for a moment the kitchen felt full of life again. When breakfast was ready, they sat at the small table, eating quietly. The food wasn't fancy. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. But somehow it felt like the most comforting meal in the world. "This is nice," Daniel said. "It feels normal." Emma nodded. "I forgot what normal felt like," she admitted. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Maybe we can find it again." Those words stayed in her mind longer than they should have. Something about the way he said we made her heart tremble. She didn't know why it affected her so deeply. But it did. She realized that since Daniel had arrived, the house had started to feel warm again, like it was breathing after years of stillness. After breakfast, Emma washed the dishes while Daniel stood beside her, drying them. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, and each time it sent a quiet rush through her chest. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the water and the rhythm of their hands. But then Daniel spoke softly. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, without looking up. "Do you ever think about starting over?" He asked. She paused, the plate still in her hands. "Starting over?" she repeated, "like moving somewhere new, or just letting yourself live again?" She stared at the running water, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," she said finally. "It's hard to think about that when you've lost so much." He nodded slowly. "I get that," he said. "But maybe starting over doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe it just means allowing new memories to exist too." His voice was gentle, but his words carried weight. Emma turned to him, seeing something honest and raw in his eyes. "You sound like your father," she whispered. "He used to say things like that." Daniel smiled softly. "Guess he taught me more than I realized." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with quiet emotion, with all the things they couldn't say out loud. Emma looked at him and saw not just her husband's son, but a man who had grown through pain and kindness. Someone who carried both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. She placed the last plate on the rack and reached for a towel. But when she turned, she didn't realize how close he was. Their faces were just inches apart. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The air felt still, the moment fragile. Daniel's hand lifted slightly, not to touch her, but to steady the plate she was holding. Their fingers brushed and time seemed to slow. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's fine," she said quickly. Her pulse racing, she turned away, trying to breathe, trying to push away the confusion flooding her. It wasn't attraction she felt, at least not in the way she used to understand it. It was something deeper, emotional, something that made her feel seen again. Daniel stepped back, giving her space. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," he said quietly. "You didn't," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "It's just been a long time since someone's been this kind." He gave her a small smile. "You deserve kindness." Emma. The word struck her deeply, because for so long, she had forgotten what that felt like. The kindness she had known before was from a husband who had loved her fiercely. And when he was gone, she'd convinced herself that love and warmth were things of the past. But here stood Daniel, patient, steady, reminding her that life hadn't ended with loss. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Daniel fixed a broken cabinet handle while Emma folded laundry. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them felt peaceful, like the calm after a long storm. Every so often, she would glance toward him, noticing how focused he looked, how his hands moved with quiet confidence. And every time he looked up and caught her watching, she'd smile and look away quickly. By afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds, filling the kitchen with golden light. Daniel leaned against the counter, sipping water. "I should probably head back tomorrow," he said. "There's work waiting for me." Emma's heart sank a little. "Of course," she said, trying to sound calm. "You've stayed longer than you planned already." He nodded. "I just didn't expect to feel this connected again." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither spoke. The sunlight hit his face just right, highlighting the quiet sincerity in his expression. "You've helped me more than you know," he said softly. "Being here, talking to you, it reminded me of what matters." Emma felt her throat tighten. "You've helped me too, Danielle," she said. "You brought this house back to life." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it was never the house," he said. "Maybe it was you." Her heart skipped a beat, not because of romance, but because of truth. He wasn't flirting or saying something he didn't mean. He was simply being honest. And that honesty felt like light seeping into the corners of her soul that had been dark for too long. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, they made dinner together one last time. The kitchen was filled with the smell of rosemary and garlic, the faint hum of music playing softly in the background. They laughed about small things, shared quiet glances, and when the meal was done, they lingered at the table long after, not wanting the moment to end. When Daniel finally stood, he looked around the kitchen, his voice low. "This place feels like home again." Emma nodded, her heart full. "It always was," she said. "You just reminded me." He stepped closer, not too close, but enough for her to see the emotion in his eyes. "Thank you for letting me in," he said. "Thank you for coming back," she replied. The clock ticked softly, and for a moment, it felt like the world had gone still. Daniel reached out, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. It was a small, tender gesture, nothing more, nothing less, but it carried 1,000 words they didn't need to say. "Take care of yourself," he whispered. "You too," she said, her voice trembling. He turned to leave, and as the door closed behind him, Emma stood in the kitchen, her hands pressed to her chest, feeling both full and empty all at once. Outside, the evening breeze moved through the garden, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Inside, the house felt quiet but not lonely anymore. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt peace, not because her pain was gone, but because she had remembered how to feel again. She looked around the kitchen, the same room that had once felt haunted by silence, and smiled softly. The warmth Daniel had brought still lingered there, In every corner, in every quiet breath of morning light, Emma whispered into the stillness, as if speaking to Richard. "You were right," she said gently. "Life does find a way to keep loving us." And in that moment, as the last light of day touched the walls, Emma felt something deep and certain. Grief and love could live side by side, and sometimes healing didn't come from forgetting, but from learning to open your heart again, even when it trembled, even when it hurt. The kitchen, once cold and silent, now held the quiet warmth of new beginnings. And for Emma, that was enough.